Good day, Internet. We are Chavez and Valco. We are an immigration law firm and the key to your immigration solutions. I'm Senior Associate Benjamin Hamilton, and with me is Associate Attorney Andrew Craven. How you doing, Andrew?
Doing good, Ben. How about yourself?
I am ready to talk about big time money. Not money that we're earning, but rather money that people are investing in the United States in order to earn a green card. Um, as always, when you see our smiling faces, that we're talking about all things employment based immigration. That is what we do all day, every day. While as a firm, we do all immigration. Andrew and I, it's employment. Um, we've been doing a series of videos trying to cover every single non immigrant visa and also immigrant visa category. When you hear immigrant, that's green card. We did a video already on the EB-5 program, basically green card through investment. That was more in a general way, talking about the investment, source of funds, and direct investment scenarios. Today, we are going to be talking specifically about the regional center program. So that is a component of EB-5 uh, that went away for a little bit and is now back. So, Andrew, what is the EB-5 program?
So basically, the EB-5 program allows investors who are eligible to apply for green cards if they, one, make the necessary investment in a commercial enterprise in the U.S., and two, they plan to create or preserve 10 permanent full-time jobs for qualified U.S. workers.
So, based on again, there's gonna be a lot of caveats here because Congress reauthorized the EB-5 Regional Center program because it's not permanent; it has to be reauthorized. And when they reauthorized it this time, they finally instituted a whole bunch of changes, right? And those we're still kind of sorting through and figuring out. So there's gonna be some caveats here and a lot of, hey, well, the law just recently did this. Anyway, based on the recent law, what is the necessary investment?
So it's either 1,050,000, which is lower to the 800,000 if the investment's in what's called a targeted employment area.
So again, we're going to get into that a little bit later. But first, what is a regional center?
So a regional center is defined as any economic unit, whether it's public, private, which is involved with the promotion of economic growth, including increased export sales, improved regional productivity, job creation, and increased domestic capital investment.
Well, that's their fancy definition. The simple definition is it's something that's set up to pool investments. That's pretty much what it is, right? Because your typical EB-5 is a direct investment model, right? I'm investing money in this company, that I own and that I'm going to develop, right? Regional centers where, hey, I'm going to get approval to pool investments from a bunch of people and then deploy that into like some larger scale project that's going to create jobs. Um, does a regional center need to like apply with USCIS, seek some sort of approval to be considered as a regional center?
Yes, so the regional center has to file what's called Form I-924, which is the application for regional center designation under the Immigrant Investor Program.
So, I mean, just kind of what are some of the basics that go into that?
So some of the basics are a clearly identified geographical region. You got a name where this place is going to take place, a detailed description of how the capital investment will create qualifying jobs, also a detailed prediction of the national impact on household earning, business services, utilities, maintenance, and all of that, and repair and construction. And then finally, the administrative structure of the center.
And that last one is going to have a lot of changes a lot of changes from this new law that was passed because a lot of it was focused on the regional centers and who can be involved and how often do they have to report and what do they have to disclose. They're going to be far, far, far more transparent, not only just sort of in general, but specifically to the investors in terms of, again, disclosing who's involved, certain people being prevented from being involved, financial disclosures, and all this. So that last part, the administrative structure, is going to be much bigger. I want to actually say one thing is that, in this video, we're focusing this discussion more towards the investor. Like, what is this? How is it structured? What is it going to look like? We'll probably at a later date, once we've kind of sorted through this new law, do a video that's about regional centers, but more directed at someone maybe looking to set one up, or maybe a developer, someone looking to utilize one to fund a project. But this is more directed at the investors. So the regional center, right? It does have to describe, well, what's our area going to be. So you can't just say, I have a regional center, I'm going to do projects in New York, I'm going to do projects in California. No, it has to have a defined area. I mean, even within the state of Texas, you can't just be like, oh, all of Texas, right? It's like, well, no. I mean, Dallas, you have one like Dallas, one that's like Houston. Now, there are some companies that you'll see, that you'll hear about, like big ones like Civitas or CMB, where you're like, oh, CMB is a regional center. Well, actually, no. CMB is so big at this point that they've set up multiple regional centers, right? So they have projects all over the nation, but in order to do that, they have to have 10, 12, 15 different regional centers. And the regional centers application tends to go into more of like, well, what's our sort of overall sort of plan? So, but what about a specific project? Does the regional center need to submit detailed information regarding a specific project?
Yes, so this actually ties back in with the new law that we've been talking about. So in the past, this was called the Exemplar I-526, and it was optional. Now, under the new law, this is mandatory.
You have two different things here. There's getting the regional center set up, but then also getting the specific project approved. Those are two different things. And when it came to the project, you had two options, right? You used to be able to say, okay, well, I'm going to submit a test case. So basically everything that an investor would submit, but with no investor. Like, here's all the project documents, subscription agreements, all that stuff, but there's actually no investor. We're going to submit it and get it pre-approved. Or you could just get all your investors signed up and then file their cases, and see how it goes. The main reason that you would want an exemplar is for marketing reasons. If I'm trying to go out and get people to invest in my project and I've already submitted an exemplar and I got it approved, I can say, hey, our project's approved. Invest with us. It's a secure investment. Problem is it was taking like 2 years to get those exemplars, and who has 2 years to wait just to even start their funding? Now, project approval is mandatory. Because again, one regional center can have multiple projects as long as they're all in the same area and all that. Again, we're not going to get into necessarily the nitty gritty of how to set up a regional center. That's for another video. Now, in terms of the investment, we talked about the amounts, and we also mentioned that the lower amount is in a targeted employment area. Just briefly, what is a targeted employment area?
So historically, a targeted employment area was just a rural or high unemployment area is designated by a state authority.
Some states delegated that farther down to cities and counties. And you can believe me that any city or county is going to want to designate something as a TEA if it's going to bring in investment. I mean, they've proved everything as a TEA. So what has changed under the new law regarding TEAs?
They're still defined world the same way, but they now receive priority processing. High unemployment areas have also been narrowed and can only be determined by USCIS. So taking that authority from the states and who they've sent it to and moving that all over to the federal government. The law also added infrastructure projects in which the government entity contracts for EB-5 financing to develop public works. So also really trying to target this more in actual low employment areas, rural areas, and improving infrastructure as well.
That's obviously one, as an investor, one of the important things to know about a regional center is, are you seeking some type of TEA designation, or are you, because obviously that affects the amount of investment. Now, my experience historically has been that regional centers are like 95% got themselves into TEAs, right? Uh, because it'd be much harder to try to market a project if you weren't, because people had to pay more. Now we're going to have to see because there's still gonna be that desire. I want to be in a TEA because again, it's easier to attract investors with a lower investment amount. But you're gonna have to see how that starts to shift projects. Like, are we finally gonna start to see more rural projects because it's easier to get a TEA and gets priority processing? So when you're looking at people from like countries where there's backlogs, basically China, and we may start to see backlogs from Vietnam and India. If you're from England, you're like, I don't care if it's rural, whatever. Um, but if you're like from China or India in particular, especially China, you're gonna have much more of an incentive now to like invest in a regional center that qualifies as rural. Not only for the TEA but for the priority processing. Also, we may start to see a lot more infrastructure projects than we'd seen in the past. Now, not going to get into the nitty gritty of source and funds and all that. We did that in our other EB-5 videos. So if you want to look at kind of all of the stuff about the source of funds, the path of funds, and all of that, documenting it, and some more stuff regarding the investment, look at our other EB-5 video. Now, job creation. So it says you have to create 10 permanent full-time jobs for qualified U.S. workers, but I'm sure that there's a lot of caveats here. So what do they consider as direct jobs?
So that's jobs that establish an employer-employee relationship between the new commercial enterprise and the person it employs. So basically, people that you're hiring, your employees.
So one of the first terms we run into here, first one was the TEA, right? Second, acronym we run into here is the NCE, the New Commercial Enterprise, right? That's the legal term for the entity where the investment goes. And in a direct investment scenario, the where the money goes and where the jobs created is the same thing. It's all within the NCE, right? And so you'd have direct jobs. Does the regional center program allow for indirect job creation to be counted?
Yes, with certain requirements after the new law. So the indirect jobs are kind of these jobs held by persons who work outside of the new commercial enterprise, but it was created because of it. So employees of the producers of materials, equipment, services, and other things used by the new commercial entity and the job creating entities around it. It also includes jobs which are calculated through different economic models.
That's the key is there are these accepted economic models that people use in order to sort of come up with the number of job creation. So obviously, if you're an investor looking to invest, not only are there's all the sort of documentation regarding the actual investment itself, but there's also these really detailed business plans and economic impact reports that can be hundreds of pages that have all of the economic methodology and modeling and job creation, all that. So obviously, if you're looking to invest, they should be showing you that stuff. If they're not showing you that stuff, you probably don't want to invest with these people. They may be being a little bit shady. Um, so for I guess the first question is, do the indirect jobs need to take place in the NCE?
No, they don't in this case.
For indirect jobs, does USCIS distinguish between full-time and part-time?
No, it's all pretty much the same.
What about construction jobs? So there's a lot of these indirect jobs that are based on economic modeling. So it's like I'm not able to look and say, here's a 1099 or here's a W-2. It's more based on my economic projection. What about construction jobs, right? Because a lot of the EB-5 regional center projects are these big, like multi-use, $100 million sort of like buildings. And those construction jobs are like where there's actually a 1099 where I can produce documentation to actually point to a specific person. How do they count construction jobs?
So these direct construction jobs do qualify, but only if the position is expected to last at least 2 years. So basically, you have to look at how long the construction's actually going to be going on for.
Yeah, so some of like the under 2 years, like can get caught up in sort of the economic modeling, but the like over 2 years are actually generally considered more like direct job creation. Um, What if I have a project and it's because you remember I have to do 10 jobs per investor. So if I have 10 investors in this project, I need to create at least 100 jobs. But what if I have non EB-5 investors in the project?
So in this case, they actually allow all jobs maybe credited to the EB-5 investors. So the non-investors don't exactly dilute your pool.
What changes did the new law make regarding sort of job creation and counting?
So the indirect jobs are still allowed, but they can only account for 90% of the jobs and 75% of the jobs that come from the construction lasting less than 2 years.
So basically, if I have to create 10 jobs per person, one of those has got to be like direct employment, and nine can be indirect. Oh, actually, one of the other things they did talk about is there's this thing called oh my gosh, I'm blanking on the term tenant occupancy, which is something that's gone back and forth. And there was a memo and it was rescinded. And it did clarify that tenant occupancy is acceptable. Basically, what that means is that if I'm creating this, let's say I'm creating this large building and it's going to be mixed use, right? So it's going to be like, hey, floors 2 through like 50 are going to be apartments, but like the first 1 or 2 floors are going to be commercial. And what if businesses are moving into that commercial space? Can I count that tenant occupancy? In the general, the way USCIS has generally looked at that is saying those can be counted as long as it's new jobs. And this law went and just kind of cemented that idea that's kind of already been around. So if you had a Domino's that existed over here and you built this nice shiny new space and they just move, that doesn't count. Those jobs already existed. But if you had a Domino's over here and then you build this nice shiny space and like, we're going to open a second location over here, the tenant occupancy that could be counted because that's actually creating new jobs as opposed to just moving them from one place to another. Again, this law did a lot of it created a lot of new things, but there was a lot of things that it didn't necessarily create. It just cemented them, like basically positions USCIS had but weren't necessarily written in the law, and just said, okay, this is officially now in the law. Um, so we'll talk a little bit about the investor themselves, right? Because are EB-5 regional center investments considered securities offerings?
Yes, so they're regulated by the Security and Exchange Commission, but typically fall under an exemption from actually having to register with the SEC.
Anytime we hear those initials, SEC, everyone's like duck and cover. Oh crap! Like, what's going on? So yeah, you can't. So what this really does is it kind of means that you can't just get any old person to invest. So what are these exemptions that that the typical exemptions that they utilize?
So 506B offerings cannot use general solicitation, but can have up to 35 non-accredited, or sorry, no accredited investors. And 506C offerings can use general solicitation, but the securities must be sold to accredited investors.
That's that kind of key term, like an accredited investor. So that, again, it doesn't mean not just anybody can invest in a regional center. What is a accredited investor?
So this is someone who's earned income that exceeded 200,000 or 300,000 with a spouse in each of the prior 2 years, or has a net worth of over 1 million, either alone or together with a spouse, excluding the person's primary residence and loan secured by that residence.
Yeah, so depending on how the regional center is set up, they may only accept accredited investors. So you have to meet show you meet these criteria, or they may have a limited number of accredited investors. So they may be like, oh, we have 50 slots, but only 35 can be from non-accredited investors. So you could show up and be like, yeah, we have slots available, but it's only for accredited investors. The non-accredited ones have already been taken up. So again, it can't just be any old person investing in the regional center. Of course, we also talked about in another video, went into depth on about source of funds. You got to prove you got legitimate money, too. So, what type of documentation is usually generated between the investor and the NCE?
So there's actually a number of documents, including an offering memorandum, a subscription agreement, limited partnership agreement, and so on and so forth.
The main takeaway here is that if an EB-5 regional center is doing its job, these are not tiny little applications. Historically, they are 1,500 pages plus. Easy. Because again, you have this massive economic impact report, massive business plan. You have all the subscription agreements, which are like 50 pages, limited partnership agreements, all of the investor source of funds. Now, this may change a little bit going forward, right? Because a lot of that stuff, like the business plan, economic impact report, goes with the project. But now, if the projects are having to be pre-approved, you may not actually have to include a lot of that stuff with the individual investor's application. They can focus more on the, hey, I invested the money. Here's my source of funds. So going forward, it may not be 1,500 for the investor. It may be less because, again, we take out all the project stuff because that was already like pre-submitted, pre-approved going forward. But still, these things are heavily, heavily, heavily documented. You will be signing a lot of forms. Now, let's talk a little bit about what the typical EB-5 sort of investment structure looks like. A lot of people are like, well, what am I investing in? Right. And am I investing, like, am I literally getting ownership in this thing that's like creating, building something? Or, or is it just like, hey, this project's $5 million, whatever? We're going to kind of talk about that a little bit. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the EB-5 capital stack. More often than not, EB-5 is only a small percentage of the total investment, right? For two reasons. One, you don't want EB-5 to be 100% of the required money because that just makes the project riskier, right? Because, hey, if one person backs out or one perfect person gets denied, it's way easier for the project to kind of fall apart and then everybody's screwed. Plus, that's not the type of money that people are looking for. So when it comes to the regional center, usually what it is some type of developer looking for additional financing. And EB-5 kind of stepped up. Well, what happened is that in 2008, 2009, we had a global recession and access to credit largely dried up. And so developers started looking around and saying, well, where can I get some financing? And that's when EB-5, which had been around since the 90s, really just exploded, right? Because what normally happens here is the developer, they're kicking in some equity. You see right here, it's like, let's say 10%. And they go to a bank and say, hey, we want a loan to do this project. Bank obviously is like, well, great, put up your collateral, which could be, if you're building a building, it'd be the building itself and all of that. And they get a construction loan. But then more often than not, there's a gap, right? Here, in the example, construction loan is 70%, equity is 10%, there's a 20% gap. Well, how do I fill that gap? I can go, let's say, and try to bring in some equity partners, right? But they're going to want a pretty high return. Also, they may be not want to invest because the construction loan is going to have first preference, meaning if things go sideways, whoever gave me the construction loan gets first dibs on whatever's left, and there may not be anything left for me, the investor. So there's this cute little structure a lot of people use called a mezzanine loan. It's basically a loan to fill gap financing that's allowed by the primary lender, and has some security for the actual mezzanine loan lender, right? But these mezzanine loans, because it's higher risk for the lender, right? Because they're in second position to the construction loan, they have a really high interest rate. They can be 12, 15% sometimes. And this is where EB-5 comes into play. Perfect gap financing. Why? Because one, as we talked about in our first video, EB-5 is not allowed to have a lot of security. The money has to be at risk. So there's a lot of things that you would have in a lot of loans that you can't have in EB-5. So from the developer standpoint, it's like, haha, I get this money, but I don't have to promise a whole lot. Secondly, Andrew, are EB-5 investors in this for the money because they're going to make a high return?
They're in it because they want to invest to ultimately try and get the green card.
Exactly. So that means not only do I not have to give them, I can't give them a lot of guarantees because again, the money has to be at risk, but also I can sometimes get this gap financing at a super, super duper low interest rate. Because again, the investors, they're not in this for the money, they're in this for the green card. So whereas like a mezzanine loan could cost my gap financing via mezzanine loan could cost me 12 to 15%, I could do EB-5 financing for like 5% and sometimes less, right? So from a developer standpoint, this was amazing. A way to access capital, and the EB-5. That's when the EB-5 program, I mean, just exploded after 2008, 2009. Again, this is how most EB-5 projects are structured. So if you're going to a regional center and you're saying, well, how big is your EB-5 need? And they say, well, we need 30 million. That's not because the total project cost is 30 million. It's usually gap financing, meaning the total project cost maybe 100 million. And they're just using the EB-5 as this gap financing. So we've thrown out terms like the regional center, like the new commercial enterprise. And there's a third one in EB-5 called the job creating entity, the JCE, NCE, JCE, RC, all these lovely terms. So now let's look at how this is actually structured in terms of how the projects and everything are set up. So that's our next slide here. It's kind of a busy slide. So Andrew, are you actually investing your money in the regional center? Are you handing the regional center your investment and then they're putting it into their bank account?
No. So it actually is, I mean, more complicated, as you can kind of see. Like initially, it's going to the escrow.
Well, the escrow is optional, and that may or may not occur depending on how you're set up. So the way this is actually set up is there's three entities that are legally separate and distinct. And again, not everyone follows this model, but this is the most common model. So the regional center is this legally distinct entity, right? It's incorporated separately, it has its own sort of management, and the regional center went and got pre-approval. But the regional center is not receiving the money, and that's not what you're investing in. You're investing in the NCE, the new commercial enterprise, which is a legally distinct thing. More often than not, the new commercial enterprise is a limited partnership. So all of the investors are limited partners. The general partner is more often than not the regional center. There are some regional center organizations that are so big that they've actually created a whole other entity, this management entity, to be the general partner. So there's like the regional center, the NCE, and then there's like some other entity like the RCGP, right? The regional center general partner does all the management. It gets confusing. But the idea is that you are not investing in the regional center. It's just there as the person that's kind of like, I don't know, the offensive coordinator, right? The coach. They're out there just kind of directing traffic. So you invest in this limited partnership. And if you see here from our thing, right, we see all of our investors, their money is going to the new commercial enterprise. Kind of in between them and the new commercial enterprise are agents. So in a lot of cases, China in particular, right, you don't just go out and find the investor directly. There's these agents that you go through that can help you find the investors, or maybe already have the investors and are just looking for somewhere to invest the money. These agents can make a lot of money. Sometimes they get paid per investment, all that. One of the things in the new law is that these agents now actually have to like register, and the regional center has to disclose, who these agents are. Because before, I mean, it could have been anybody. It was the wild, wild west. So they invest their money in the limited partnership, which is the new commercial enterprise. Andrew, they put all their money. Their money didn't go to the regional center. It went to the NCE. Is the NCE the one developing the project and creating the jobs?
No. So they would actually then be handling the loan to the ones actually creating the jobs.
So that's our box there to the right, the job creating entity, or the JCE. That's essentially the developer, right? That's the person who's going and actually creating the jobs, developing the project. So you as the investor, you have no ownership in the actual project, at least directly, right? The project, because the project is not being done within the NCE. The project's being done within the JCE. And what the NCE does is loans the money, right? So if the NCA got 10 investors, what's 10 times 800,000? 8 million? I'm bad at math. So if the NCE got 10 investors and they pooled that 8 million, what they're doing is they're loaning that 8 million to the JCE, to the job creating entity, right? Now, again, if you look here on the far right of our thing, you'll see that there's that additional funding coming in, like usually in like terms of equity, terms of like a traditional construction loan, right? So that loan between the NCE and the JCE is usually like a mezzanine loan. That's the gap financing, right? So again, you as the investor are not directly investing in the project. You have no ownership in the project. You invest in this limited partnership who then loans money to the JCE. And of course, that loan has a term, it has an interest rate. And so that money is slowly getting paid back. Here's the kind of funny thing. So there may be that, just say that interest rate's like 5%. Does all that 5% go back to the NCE? Like to the investors?
I'm gonna guess no.
It depends how it's set up, right? It may be very well that the regional center has points on the loan. I've seen cases in which the agent has points on the loan. So I've seen scenarios in which the interest rate on this loan was like 4% or something, but only 0.5% was actually going back to the investors. And that's a terrible return. But again, they're not in it for that. They're in it for they're not in it for the money, they're in it for the green card. So often than not, the agent and or the regional center or someone else is making more off of that loan in terms of points and whatnot. And the other thing you can see here, right, is we have multiple NCEs, meaning one regional center can have multiple projects. Now, of course, now they have to get each project pre-approved. In order to do this, but you can have one regional center, let's say that's set up to cover the Dallas area, and then you'd be like, oh yeah, we have a project in downtown Dallas. Oh, we have a project over here in Fort Worth. Oh, we have this other project going up in Frisco, and each is its own NCE with its own, oh, this one needs 40 million, this one needs 20 million, this one needs 10 million, right? So they have the number of people that are subscribing to each is different, and there very well may be a different JCE in each case too, right? Now here's another quite random question. Are the owners or the people involved with the JCE necessarily the same as those involved with the regional center?
Not necessarily, no.
Yeah, that's kind of a maybe question. There are some regional centers that like kind of will go find their own projects and set up a JCE. But often, sometimes there'll just be a developer that comes to the regional center and says, "I want to do this project. Will you take it on?" And then they work with the regional center to get everything set up and make it happen. In that case, usually the regional center gets paid a bunch of money. They get points on the loan. They make a lot of money off of that. Here's another question. Now, the investment is going into the new commercial enterprise. That doesn't mean the regional center is not making money. Is the investor paying any money directly to the regional center?
Yes, I mean there would, ultimately be fees just every step of the way.
So more often than not, regional centers charge an administrative fee, and that fee can range from like $30,000 to $60,000, right? So let's say I'm bringing in 10 investors. Well, those 10 investors are going to pay $800,000 each if it's in a targeted employment area, meaning that they're going to put $8 million into that new commercial enterprise, which is then going to be loaned to the job creating entity. But I mean, let's just do the math here. If they have an admin fee of, don't you love it when you try to do something and it goes onto a random screen? Oh, great. My computer's not working now. All I wanted to do was do math. So if I had 10, that's what, it's $8 million, right? But then each of those is paying a $50,000 administrative fee. That means the regional center is receiving $500,000, right? And that's just, they're making money. Now, obviously, they have their own costs because they're hiring people to write the business plans and prepare all their SEC, document subscription agreements and all that. There's lots of lawyers' costs. There's a lot of expenses, but hey, you just made $500,000 for bringing in those 10 investors. And again, depending on how it's set up, you may be also earning interest on that $8 million loan to the JCE. And then sometimes this may change, but there also may be, sometimes the regional center would charge the JCE saying, hey, you need 8 people. Well, you're going to have to pay us like, 10 grand for each person we bring if we, whatever. Let's just say there was a lot of people who got interested in regional centers because they're like, hey, I have this project. This sounds like a good idea. And then once they kind of got involved with the regional center, they realized, oh, I can make more money running a regional center than actually developing stuff. Like this regional center thing, this is a great business. Like we're just making money hand over fist over here. So that this is kind of how everything is set up. So again, talking to you, if you're an investor and you're interested in this and you go to the regional center, don't be surprised, right? When they're like, yeah, well, see, our next project is actually called the you know, Civitas Dallas mezzanine loan LP. And you're like, wait, what is this? That I'm what? That's the NCE? What? It's like, well, yes. See, we have this project over here that's going to be done in Dallas. And this is basically the limited partnership we set up that everyone's going to invest into. And then we're going to loan it to the project. And the project's going to be the one that creates the jobs and yada, yada, yada. Now, Andrew, the weird thing about this structure is it creates a problem because EB-5 takes forever, right? And it's a multi-step process, right? We've talked about in our other video about how, well, the investor files an I-526, gets conditional residency, then they have to apply to remove the conditions, and this all takes forever. But this is set up as a loan. The loan has a term, meaning it'll be repaid in a certain amount of time, like let's say 5 years. But after 5 years, the investor may not have gotten all the way through the process yet. So that means the money is kind of not at risk because it's now just sitting back in the NCE. It's just sitting in the NCE's bank account. Did the law kind of mention anything about that, the new law?
Believe did it give guidance?
It actually didn't give any guidance. It just told USCIS they need to issue guidance because this has been an issue now for years, right? Especially with the backlogs in China for years. And, everyone's been kind of scrambling to figure out, well, what do I do with this money? If I just leave it in the NCE, do I have to redeploy it? And everyone kind of came to the conclusion that, like, I need to redeploy it. I can't just, like, leave it in the bank account because it's not at risk, nor could I just, like, I don't know, invest it in some index funds or something. That they needed to redeploy it. But into what and for how long? Some people were like, well, what if I just have another project? Instead of bringing in 10 new investors, I can just redeploy the money from the first 10 investors into the second project. And the typical USCIS fashion, right? They're more than willing to deny you and give you hell over something that they don't like, when at the same time, they're completely tight-lipped and don't tell you what it is that they want. So did the law lay out specific, like, well, how do you, sort of redeploy funds to keep them at risk? It did not. But it did tell USCIS, yo, you got to make some rules about this, which we know that in October of 2020, Congress told USCIS that they needed to expand premium processing. Of course, it is now April of 2022. They haven't done it yet, right? So even though you tell them to do something, if you don't give them a timeline, they can drag their feet. But yes, so you could take this whole thing and take out NCE 2, 3, and 4, right? But keep job creating entity 2, 3, and 4, because what happened is money went from NCE 1 to JCE 1, back to NCE 1, and then out to JCE 2, and then back to NCE 1, and then out to JCE 3. Like, again, you could keep recycling this money back into other job creating entities to keep it at risk until the investors. And again, the weird thing too is it can vary from investor to investor, because if I have, like, I don't know, a British investor, they're probably going to get through the process faster than a Chinese investor. So his money, I may just actually repay to the NCE, and then boom, he gets approved, and then the money just gets repaid to him. Whereas it's the Chinese investor that I'm having to, like, redeploy the funds because the backlogs are stuck in the process longer. It is all very technical, very confusing, and could very well be that here pretty soon some of this is going to change based on this new law and how people are going to have to structure stuff. But again, Andrew, when you first heard about regional centers and EB-5 and all of this, did you think it was going to look like that?
No. I think the first time I heard EB-5, I was just as ignorant as most people, and I was like, "Wait, cool, you can just, like, buy a visa for $1 million at the time," and, the more I learned, yeah, it's just very complicated.
Well, again, I mean, a lot of times the biggest mistake people think is they're like, "Oh, so if you guys have this project, like, hey, you know what? Let's just have some fun right now." Let me get a little bit of whoops. That is not what I was looking for. Um, Good thing y'all can't see uh my screen. So some of the bigger ones are like Civitas and like CMB. So if you go like to CMB, right, and you're like, oh, what are their, I don't know, current projects? Well, of course, they don't have any current projects because the program is on hiatus, and so they're going to start showing up soon. But if you start looking at their, current projects, um, here's one from Dallas, Texas, Stillwater Deep Ellum. Andrew, you know what that is?
S
Stillwater.
there's a Stillwater town way out in West Texas. I
No,
think
this is
there's a
Deep Ellum.
Stillwater, Oklahoma. I'm trying to think of what's in is it like a bar or a
It's probably a
restaurant?
bar or hotel or something. Because Deep Ellum here in Dallas is that like area that used to be a bunch of factories, but it's all been like gentrified, and now it's like all these like cool bars and stuff. Um, but anyway, I mean, for example, this project in Dallas, Texas, was a $60 million project. Um, the EB-5 portion of it was 15 million. So again, this was when it was 500,000. So they brought in 30 investors, and it supposedly created 607 jobs. Remember, you don't want to have a 1-to-1 ratio. You don't want to be like, well, we have 30 investors. This is going to create 300 jobs, right? Because there's no job buffer, meaning if anything goes slightly wrong, somebody's getting screwed, right? So again, if you're an investor looking at a project, you want to know what's your job buffer, right? Is it like 1.5? Is it 2? So in this case, the job buffer was 2, right? Which is good, 2 to 1. Um, they have a lot of projects here. Let's look at another fun Dallas one. The Harwood Hotel, $95 million investment. Um, the EB-5 loan was about 27.5 million, and they brought in 55 investors and created 2,700 jobs. So wow, yeah, they had quite the buffer there. And again, these are just the ones I'm seeing here in Texas. Another one, Mansfield, Texas, 38 million. The EB-5 alone was 8 million, 16 investors, created 228 jobs. A little bit smaller buffer there, right? They needed 160, they got 228. That was a little bit tighter, but there was still a buffer. Um, Another one in Dallas, Texas. The other thing sometimes you can see too is sometimes you have projects that are so big that the NCE JCE is not one project, but one phase of a project. There was EB-5 related, which was this like $1 billion project in New York, and they got some EB-5 financing. And this project was so massive, like I said, well over $1 billion, that like the EB-5, each sort of like NCE was like a phase of the project, as opposed to like, hey, there's this hotel, then there's this hotel. Uh, Here's another one in Dallas. It was 108 million. The EB-5 loan was 38.5. They had 77 investors, and they created 1,200 jobs. Um, Again, most of those are indirect or construction jobs, not direct jobs. So you're starting to kind of see how a lot of these things are structured, right? And if you go down this list of projects, you're going to see that most of them are they're hotels, they're apartments, they're mixed use buildings. It's a lot of real estate. Although I do remember this one, uh, Great Wolf Lodge. They got EB-5 money. I remember seeing that one. Just being like, okay, that's interesting. Um, but I have seen infrastructure projects in the past. I think we're going to start seeing more of those. I know they were doing some like rail lines in Florida that were like infrastructure projects. You've seen some with ports, like expanding uh, uh, ports and stuff like that have been in EB-5. You start seeing more of that. The other big one is I think you're going to start seeing a lot more rural projects because I mean you look at all these and they're pretty much all Dallas, Los Angeles. There's some in Florida, but they tended to be heavily concentrated in urban areas because it was really easy to get that TEA designation back in the past. Getting a TEA designation in like downtown Dallas these days, much more difficult. And so you're going to see maybe less EB-5 money going there. But like I said, this is a fascinating space, very complicated, obviously in the midst of some pretty big changes. Andrew, you have any final comments, words of wisdoms, opinions on the EB-5 Regional Center program?
I do not.
I'm disappointed on this gigantic list of stuff. I was hoping that'd go down to the bottom and it'd be like total jobs, total investment, right? To just say, hey, look, but this is easily got to be just in this one regional center. This has got to be $3-4 billion in total investment. The EB-5 portion is probably more like $1 billion, maybe. And jobs. Oh my gosh! I mean, I'm just scrolling through this. And I'm looking at
one project alone has 30,867.
Oh my gosh!
It's a long list.
No, here's a project. Total project 1.6 billion. EB-5 portion 450 million. 900 investors, 13.5 thousand jobs. I mean, so when you go down this list, and this is just one big player in the space, right? CMB, they're like one of the biggest. But you're looking at in terms of just EB-5 money, easily over $1 billion. And in terms of jobs, gosh, I mean, probably 30,000 jobs or more. All right. And that's just one regional center. I mean, so again, people ask, well, why are we doing this? Why are we letting people kind of pay to play? It's for that. Tens of thousands, if not collectively hundreds of thousands of jobs, $1 billion of investment, right? So if you're like, hey, why are we allowing this? You're like, well, what do you do for work? Well, I work in construction. It's like, well, what did you do? Well, we built this hotel over there. Well, how do you think they got some of the financing to build that hotel that paid for your job? Oh yeah, EB-5 money. So the great thing is we see all these cases of money being sent out of the United States, like remittances and whatnot, where people are like, come here and they work, they send the money out. Well, this is bringing it back in to reinvest in the United States. So if you have any questions about EB-5s or anything related to immigration, go to our website. You can schedule a consultation. You can contact us through all the different social media. We are here to answer any of your questions, whether it can be like, hey, I want to do direct investment EB-5. I want to do a regional center EB-5. Hey, I'm considering this regional center. Maybe we, review the documents, see if it's all kosher and we shouldn't, if it's going to comply with immigration. Or maybe you're considering other options. I'm going to be honest, EB-5 is not always the best option. Some people see it and they think it's really cool, but it's not always the best option because it takes so long. It can be so expensive. And so we can sometimes find better alternatives, national interest waiver, multinational managers, which are cheaper and more expensive. So if you want to talk about this or other options, contact us. As always, check out our app, Lawpilot Guardian. You can find it on Android or iOS. It is a great resource for immigration updates, a lot of useful information. We're always adding new features and tools to it. But again, you need any immigration questions, Andrew and I are here to answer anything investment, employment based. And hey, if it's not that, if it's asylum, deportation, litigation, well, we got people here that can answer those questions too. But until then, Andrew, thank you as always for joining me on this complicated ride talking about big time money. But hey, until then, thanks for tuning in and, stay tuned for our next videos. And by the way, if you have a question and you can't find the answer in one of our videos, and so you have an idea, feel free to make a suggestion, comment wherever you find this video in terms of if there's something you want to see. And hey, maybe we'll make a video on that. But until then, thank you and talk to you guys later.